All right. Well, it's evening now. We're pretty close to it. So, good evening. This is a video lecture for Chapter 5 for the Crim 1 class at a Madera Community College. So, if you're logged on here, we're going to go through Chapters 5 and Chapter 6 for Crim 1. My name is Mr. Ybarra, and I'll be doing the lecture for you today. If there's any, first off, as a recommendation, please print out the PowerPoints in the Canvas, the Canvas area, so that way you'll have these PowerPoints, so that way you can follow along. They're pretty wordy, but you're able to at least follow along with them. And then if there's any notes or anything that needs to be written out, you can put them in the margins or do whatever. It'll make it easier for you during this lecture. So on to the lecture. So Chapter 5, they're talking about what police do. So policing and police, what's their role? So the first slide actually says police role and function. So police, basically all law enforcement officers or agents, their roles and functions are multifaceted and pretty complex, right? We're talking about, in the simplest terms, police are problem solvers, and I've used this example before when we're dealing with police. Funny that it uses this, and nobody calls the police to tell them that they've won the lottery. They call because there's a problem they're not able to deal with, and so that was one of the ideas that I had when I gave the assignment for your introduction. A lot of people don't like talking in front of other people during the Zoom call, but there's a method to my madness. I wanted to try to give you the experience of speaking in public because it is, nerve-wracking, right? But that's what's going to wind up happen when you become a peace officer. You're going to go walking into a volatile situation that you don't have a lot of information about. Emotions are generally going to be running real high, and people aren't going to really want to do what you want them to do. And so you're going to have to go in there to try to make sense of that situation, direct people to where you want them to go, get the people under control that need to be placed under control, and get the other ones treatment if necessary to deal with any injuries or any losses and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that are going to be going on that you're going to be responsible for. So to address some of these multifaceted problems, there has to be order and structure, right? We can't just let police unilaterally just decide what they want to do. There has to be order and structure. Most departments are organized in a hierarchical structure, which is based, we talked about this earlier, it's based on a military structure. So hierarchical means you have somebody at the top, and then you have people just below that person, delegating, and other departments, and then so on and so forth. So it goes down in like a pyramid. So you have a police chief who's the top administrator of a police department, and the police chief sets policy and maintains control of departmental practices and personnel. And the police chief is normally is an appointed position working at the pleasure of a mayor. And again, like we talked about in the earlier chapters, the police chief is appointed by a mayor. A sheriff is generally voted into office and works for the county, specifically for the people of that county. So they voted him in. It is a elected position and represents not just the city, but the county. And there's a little bit of a misunderstanding with regard to that. And so let's look at Madera, or rather, we'll look at Fresno County because it's a larger county and has a really big city, Fresno. So a lot of people believe that inside the city, that is the province of the police department, and to a certain extent, they're right. But and that's just by agreement, right? So the sheriff's department is a large department, but if it were to take on all policing roles, it would just get overwhelmed. So that's why we have a police department that's assigned for the city police. However, the city, or rather the county, the sheriff's department does have authority within the city. So not only do they have authority anywhere within the county, so if they went to, say, the lake, they went to Millerton Lake, because that's in Fresno County, it might not be in the city, they have authority there, and they also have authority within the city of Fresno. So there is what's the word I want to use? There's an agreement with regard to day-to-day operations, but the sheriff can work within the city. Most law enforcement organizations work off the basis of seniority. So this is known as a rank system, and the more time that you have within that department, the more seniority you will earn, and oftentimes this seniority gives you preferential placement and preferential treatment. So you have more access to some of the department's specialty positions. You may have better days off, or you may have better hours. So that's some of the things that seniority looks at. Seniority is also good for vacation. So they might have different vacation slots. Like within CDCR, for instance, you don't get to pick your vacation. You have slots that are available. So there'll be a 2-week slot and a 3-week slot. And if you want to take vacation, say in January 3rd, you want to have a vacation with January 3rd somewhere in there. Well, they might have 3 or 4 slots that have January 3rd vacation, and so you'll wind up taking like December 24th through January 5th. I'm just taking arbitrary dates. So that's how that would work. And if you have high enough seniority, then you would be able to bid for that and get it. And if you wanted it, you didn't have high enough seniority, and somebody else wanted those days off on vacation, then ultimately they would wind up getting them. Law enforcement personnel must have the appropriate time, usually in years, in the preceding rank to be eligible for the next step. So what that means is you have to be a police officer for a certain period of time before you'd be eligible to test for a corporal or a detective or a sergeant or whatever the rank structure is for that department. The drawback to the ranking system, there's always going to be a drawback, is that it eliminates the ability of the administration to promote personnel that may better serve high-ranking positions over individuals with time. It's supposed to be time in grade. Excuse me. So it limits their ability. So say, for instance, you have a guy that just got hired on, but he's brilliant or she's brilliant, and they are people movers and they're motivated people. The drawback to that is if they don't have the time in, then they would not be eligible to be promoted, even though they might be a really good choice for a supervisory position. So many departments have tried to work within that idea by virtue of doing a test, a preliminary test, to generate a ranking system. So if you make the minimum eligibility required, in other words, you're allowed to apply for this job, what they'll do is they'll do a test for that job that speaks to that job's requirements or some of the duties and responsibilities of that job. And then all the people who are eligible to take that job would be eligible to take that test. They take the test, and then based on their rankings within where they ranked out on that test, the hiring authority has the opportunity to look at the best people and then hire from within. I mean, it's still limiting because there might be some people who may not be able to take the test that might be really, really good candidates for this position just by virtue of the time that they don't have in. But if you're looking at it from a seniority perspective, it's probably the fairest way to do it. All right. Uniform patrol almost is the most common and highly visible components of the criminal justice system. You may see that again. Patrols service the following serve the following major purposes, and so you'll see this. They maintain a visible presence to deter crime. They maintain public order within assigned patrol areas. They enable departments to respond quickly to emergencies, right? So they work within specific areas. So like in a police department, especially in Fresno, or these larger departments, you'll see Northwest, Southwest, Central, Traffic Division. You'll see all these different things, and that's what they're talking about. Enables you to work within specific areas within that department, so that way they have immediate response. And they also identify and apprehend law offenders. They provide aid to the public. They facilitate the movement of people, traffic, and they create a feeling of security within the community. So this is some of the stuff, like I said, police officers have a wide range of responsibilities in their day-to-day activities. So a lot of people go, oh, well, they just drive around and they hand out tickets. Well, in some cases, yeah, you'll see that in the larger metropolitan areas. You might have, 20 cops that are assigned to traffic, and that's their primary responsibility. So they go in and they drive around and they go to areas that they know there are, high incidents of moving violations and/or areas where there is significant pedestrian traffic and the likelihood that there could be incidents there that could cause serious bodily injury and/or death. So they would send their resources there to try to minimize that just by virtue of being present. Remember, we talked about them being highly visible components, and just having them there is able to deter crime. So, I mean, like, how many of you people, like myself included, you're cruising down the freeway, you're doing 75, you got someplace to go, and all of a sudden you see CHP and your foot's right off the throttle, like, oh my God, I don't want this, get a ticket. And they know that. So just being out there causes people to be on their best behavior for the most part, right? You're going to have some people who are going to be really incorrigible, and they're not going to do that, but for the most part, that's what they do. So you'll probably see that again. Just pay attention to that area. All right, number 2, police responsibilities. Excuse me. I've been talking a lot today doing other lectures, so you'll have to forgive me. I'll be sipping on tea. So, all right. Many experts agree that the major amount of patrol efforts are devoted to order maintenance. Order maintenance is the idea is peacekeeping. You'll see that, and so essentially, it's again, like I said, just having a presence. Order maintenance is the aspect of the police role that involves peacekeeping, maintaining order and authority without the need to institute a formal arrest. So this is done by communication, persuasion, understanding, and an occasional threat. So you'll see law enforcement, and this is used a lot, like, excuse me, in schools. So especially with juveniles, because you want to give them as much of an opportunity to make a behavior change as you possibly can. As adults, we know that juveniles have a higher incidence of emotional outbursts. They get angry real quick, but they're also pretty quick to subside, right? And so by virtue of that, law enforcement knows, and their job is to go in and try to, quell the situation at the lowest level possible, as opposed to, excuse me, immediately jumping in and utilizing force. In the Supreme Court, SCCCCD stands for the Supreme Court of the United States. So if you see that term again, that's what it stands for, Supreme Court of the United States. Terry v. Ohio, 1968 Supreme Court found that police can stop and frisk and question a person if they have reasonable suspicion. Now, you'll hear that term again, reasonable suspicion that criminal activity has taken place, is taking place, or will take place, and reasonable suspicion that the person may be armed. So there's some misspellings in there, my apologies. So has taken place, is taking place, or will take place, and a reasonable suspicion that the person may be armed. So I don't know, many of you probably don't remember this, but at the time in excuse me, in New York, the mayor, well, the current mayor is Bill de Blasio, but in New York, the mayor out there was, I'm trying to think of his name now, and I said de Blasio and I just lost it. He's famous for instituting stop and frisk, and that was, I can't think of his darn name now. That got a lot of backlash because a lot of people believed that the stop and frisk idea was racially motivated and targeted minorities, blacks and Hispanics primarily. However, the outcome of stop and frisk, and we could argue whether or not it was racially motivated or not racially motivated all day long, but if you look at just the results showed a significant decrease in violent and property crime within the city of New York during that period of time. So the idea of stop and frisk has been upheld by Terry v. Ohio in 1968. You'll probably see that again. Proactive policing, excuse me, is when the police department adopts a policy that emphasizes stopping crimes before they occur. So studies have shown that proactive policing may help improve response times and have a deterrent effect on crime. A deterrent effect is stopping or reducing crime by convincing the criminals that they send a significant risk of being apprehended if they elect to engage in criminal activity. So much like we talked about in the previous slide, where we said that law enforcement is the idea is to try to maintain a visible presence to deter crime. This proactive policing, excuse me, expands on that idea and says that stopping and frisking, being present, law enforcement driving around, asking questions, those types of behaviors have a tendency or have been proven that it improves response times, number one, and has a deterrent effect. Now, again, on the flip side of that, there have been studies that have shown that proactive policing, if left unchecked, may have a damping effect on the community, and then they may not want to involve themselves because they feel like they're being over-policed, especially in the poorer communities or the communities where there is significant minority populations. And so you have to kind of temper those to make sure that law enforcement is actively looking for criminal behavior, but not to the point where it's invasive. Okay, so arrest and response. Evidence has shown that targeting specific crimes through directed patrol, which is a strategy that involves concentrating specific police resources in areas where certain crimes are a problem, can be successful. However, there's some evidence to suggest that aggressive policing will result in antagonism between law enforcement and the public. And we talked about that just a couple of seconds ago, right? If law enforcement goes in and cleans up the neighborhood, but has a overbearing presence where they're walking around and you're walking around, say, in an area to go shopping, and cops are out there, and they come up and they're making contact and they're asking questions and making you feel like you're a criminal. You kind of go, well, wait a minute. I mean, I want you to be out here catching the bad guys. I'm not a bad guy. The problem with that is law enforcement doesn't really know. Bad guys don't walk around with a thing that says, I'm a bad guy, I'm a criminal, I'm just not doing anything right now. So they have to kind of go in and be proactive with regard to questioning and that kind of stuff. But like I said, there is a fine line, and it can show, evidence has showed that directed patrol can result in some animosity, or in this case with the slide, antagonism between law enforcement and the public. One of the methods of response is called broken windows policing. You're going to see that again. Using the broken windows model, the term is used to describe the role of police as maintainers of the community order and safety. Law enforcement uses a cooperative approach with members of the community. The research has found 3 points in their study. Neighborhood disorder creates fear. Neighborhoods get out of crime-promoting signals, and police need citizen cooperation. So what they're talking about with broken windows policing, the idea of broken windows, is that if law enforcement, or let's look at a community as a whole. Let's say that you live in an area, everyone's got a really nice house. They're not wealthy. You're not living in a wealthy neighborhood. You just have an area that the homes are real nice. The yards are kept up. People, they're not parking on the lawns. You don't have, malt liquor 40 bottles and beer cans and everything sitting out in front. Everything's really nice and neat. There's no trash anywhere, that kind of stuff. And there's one house, right? One house that has, graffiti on it. There's boards on it. It's been abandoned, right? Generally speaking, that house is going to attract the criminal element. We talked about that earlier. So the idea of broken windows policing is saying that law enforcement can go in and make their presence known, but in order for it to really, really work, they need to have cooperation from the community members. So the neighborhood that says neighborhood disorder creates fear, right? You have that broken window, you have that house that nobody wants to go to. They get afraid of that. Neighborhoods get out of crime-promoting signals, so they basically go in and start cleaning stuff up. And when they start doing that, police become involved with the citizens there, and then crime basically disappears or finds other places to go and grow. All right. Use of technology in response and arrest has been an effective tool for policing. One of those tools is a program that was initiated in New York called CompStat. We talked about that on a previous lecture. CompStat is a program that uses carefully collected and analyzed crime data to shape departmental policy. CompStat has been proven to be very successful and is generally credited with a dramatic drop in New York City crime rate during the last decade. Many departments now utilize CompStat as a mechanism to basically catalog arrest types and locations, or incident types and locations, and then they utilize that data so that way they can delegate the correct amount of resources, either law enforcement or hard sources or soft sources, to those areas. And we talked about the difference between the hard and soft sources on a previous lecture. CompStat allows them to direct those resources more efficiently, right? So, and again, to use the same example that I used before, if you've got 20 people working in your traffic department and you've got 6 locations, most people would go, oh, okay, so you want 3 officers dedicated to traffic in each one of those 6 locations, and maybe 2 that are overlaps, right? Well, if you've got 2 of those locations that have very little to no traffic violations that are out there, we say they're pretty rural. So you're sending three cops out there, and they're basically going to be sitting there waiting for someone to violate to have some kind of moving violation. Whereas if you have a really concentrated area where there's a lot of traffic, it's like downtown Fresno, you're probably going to have more traffic violations out there, and only having 3 officers out there really stretches those resources thin. So as opposed to equally dividing stuff up and thinking that's the right way to do it, CompStat allows law enforcement, the managers and administrators, to look at the totality of circumstance with regard to arrests within the area, and then to be able to send those resources or get those resources out the way they really need to be more effective. All right. We got slide number 4, investigative function. Unfortunately, law enforcement is not present when the majority of crime takes place, right? This is why police require investigative skills. So investigators are known as detectives. That's generally the second rank. So you have officer, then you go to detective. Detectives interview witnesses, gather evidence, and collect facts at the crime scene. They also canvass neighborhoods where the crime took place and make observations, conduct interviews with friends, families, co-workers, and associates about the victim and the suspects. And then with this data, they construct timelines before, up to, and during the crime. And so they do this so that way they can hopefully find motivations and get more evidence to either eliminate potential suspects or persons of interest, or focus on potential suspects or persons of interest, depending on what they find during that process. Another approach to investigation is commonly referred to as a sting operation. All right, so a sting operation involves a group of detectives working undercover where they pose as criminals to catch real criminals in the commission of committing crimes or conspiring to commit them. Now, there is some issues with regard to that, depending on how it's done. We talked earlier a little bit about it. We said that law enforcement can get into situations where they wind up putting the thought of criminality into the head of the person who's being surveilled, right? So if they put the idea, hey, dude, you want to go out and score some dope? And the guy's like, and he's a dope fiend, and he's like, oh, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, man. Let's go do it. I know where to go. Well, if the idea didn't originate with that person, then that falls under the fruit of the poisonous tree. It's tainted evidence because the officer utilized his position to essentially entrap that individual. So when they do stings, they have to be very, very careful. They can yield, quite a few arrests, people who are actively pursuing, and a lot of these things have to do with vice crime. Okay, I mean, there's stings for other stuff, but you see a lot of it on vice crime. And we're talking about vice crime is public order crime, so prostitution, drug use, drug possession, gambling, those kind of things. So vice crime, you see a lot of sting operations. In some of the larger metropolitan areas, law enforcement departments employ vice squads. And just a second ago, I said vice. Vice is interchangeable with the idea of public order. So if you hear vice crime, that means public order crime. A vice squad is a group of police officers assigned to enforce public order laws such as prostitution and gambling. All right. Moving on to slide 5, community-oriented policing. So with community and law enforcement relations at an all-time low, especially now, I mean, they're like real bad. Programs such as police community relations and community-oriented policing were instituted in a number of major metropolitan areas. And we talked a little bit about police community relations and the program was designed, how the program was designed to make citizens more aware of police activity and attempt to improve the attitudes, the general public's attitudes specifically towards policing. Community-oriented policing programs are designed to bring police and the public closer together, creating a more cooperative work environment. Now, one of the most publicized parts of community-oriented policing was foot patrol. Now, remember we talked about technology. So as technology has improved, law enforcement, unfortunately, has lost some of those interpersonal connections with their community. Foot patrol was found to be one of the major ones, right? So foot patrol officers, they get a couple of officers out of their car and have them walking the neighborhood in an effort to reacquaint the officers with community residents in hope of forming a professional bond, right? If any of you watch Andy Griffith, and he's walking through the neighborhood and guys out there watering his lawn, and Andy's like, "Hey, how you doing, Bob?" And "Hey, how you doing, Andy?" That kind of thing. So they look at law enforcement as just another person who's just out doing a job, kind of like your mailman. Now, how many of you guys know your mailman? Some of you may, especially the ones who actually have a mailbox at their house as opposed to a community mailbox. But you see how that works, right? If you have your mailman coming to your house and delivering your mail, the likelihood is high that you know them and they know you. If he's delivering or she's delivering to a community mailbox that has like 30 and you're in an apartment complex, you probably don't know your mailman. Or if you do, it's just, "Hey, thank you, appreciate it, have a good day," right? So the idea was to get law enforcement back into the community. So community-oriented policing is designed to share power. The actual design of it was to share power between law enforcement and the communities they serve. In an attempt to decentralize law enforcement from departments, some agencies have adopted neighborhood-oriented policing policy. This community-oriented policing aimed at individual neighborhoods because each neighborhood has a particular need. Locating the police within that neighborhood allowed them to be more flexible and more adaptive specifically for the neighborhood. And we kind of do that now, especially in those larger metropolitan areas. We talked about a southwest precinct. We talked about central precinct. We talked about traffic precinct. So they do that a little bit. What they're trying to do with regard to community-oriented policing is really expand on it. One of the drawbacks to it, though, unfortunately, is that it takes a significant amount of law enforcement, because if you're going to reduce their mobility, then you have to have more to be able to cover that same area that they're responsible for. So if you take a cop out of his car and he was able or she was able to cover 10 square miles in their beat, and now they're on foot and they can cover 4 blocks, then guess what? You need more officers to be able to cover all the areas that he or she was previously responsible for. So that costs money, right? And number two, remember we talked about law enforcement having a hierarchical power, okay? So you have a boss up at the very, very top, and then that boss comes down, and then down, and then down. And so when you're talking about community-oriented policing, you're bringing that hierarchical system, and then you're introducing another decision-making component to it. So now you have community members, so members of the clergy, it could be any number of community members, business owners, that kind of stuff, who will be interjecting into that policing. And sometimes that doesn't go over very well, because then people, specifically the ground troops, they get lost in the regular beat officers are like, well, who do I take my marching orders from, right? Because they're used to getting their orders from sergeant. You have your post orders, this is your responsibility, boom, 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 and now you're getting marching orders from somebody else. And so a lot of times there are a lot of kinks to work out of community policing. All right, challenges. So there are many challenges with initiating community-oriented policing, given the hierarchy, and we talked about that. Policy decision-making comes normally from the top down. However, a community organizational chart has to be altered so bottom-up decision-making can be initiated by citizens within the patrol officers. So that generally, like I said, it doesn't work. I mean, how many of you guys, work in a large, maybe a plant or something, and you see a really good way to go ahead and get stuff fixed, but you know that you'd have to go to your boss, they'd have to go to their boss, they'd have to go to their boss, and it would require a significant amount of transference before any measurable change would take place. So sometimes hierarchies work a little bit slower, and part of that is because people want to have control of their area, right? And so it's the same thing with cops. Many police chiefs, and here we are, many police chiefs and sheriffs, as well as middle and upper management, may have difficulty in reconciling this new policing ideal, right? I mean, think about it. You're a police officer. Remember, we talked about hierarchical mobility. So you have to have time and grade. You have to have some seniority. And then you promote, you promote, you promote. And you're like, you've got 20 years in the department. And then all of a sudden you get a call by the mayor, and the mayor's telling you, oh yeah, we know that you've been doing it this way, but I need you to take the advice of this clergy member, this businessman, this person right here, and you guys are going to come up with a different plan. And now you're kind of like, well, wait a minute, am I running this or am I not running it? And so that's where there are some problems there sometimes. Community-oriented policing appears to be a valid way to address inner-city crime. However, studies have found that this type of policing works well in stable, affluent areas. And stable, affluent means areas that are established for quite a while, so the people have been there for a bit. And affluent means that they got some money. They got they got money, and that money gives them a little bit of power. They have, they can make some telephone calls to local representatives, and representatives will listen to them because that money subsidizes their political machine. And it also, this type of policing works well in areas that have a strong sense of community. And so it's hard for people to have a strong sense of community in some of the depressed areas, and that's where they really do need to have community policing. And I have my own thoughts on that. I kind of believe that the reason that's the case, especially when you're looking at these large metropolitan areas, is because a lot of people don't have a lot of pride in their community because they don't really own it, right? They don't, they're renting and that kind of stuff. So they're kind of like, it's not mine. I'm not worried about it. I'm just here to, because I have to be. When people have their own house and they have their own stuff, and, they have it through sweat equity. In other words, they earned it themselves. They're more inclined to want to take care of it, no matter how, cheap that was. If they worked hard for it, they're more inclined to want to take care of it. And so that's one of the reasons why people, like in middle class and upper middle class areas, those are real nice because people, they worked to get to those areas. Generally speaking, I mean, most people who are, upper middle class, have worked to get to where they're at, and so there is a pride there. Research has also shown that rank-and-file officers holding traditional crime-fighting values may find community policing more stigmatizing, right? Bad guy, arrest bad guy, take him to jail, and then write the report up, and then wait for my subpoena from court, go to court, testify against this guy, and he goes to jail. Whee! Diversions, when it comes to community policing, are one of the mechanisms that they use. And a diversion essentially is where, and we talked about that earlier, where a decision will be made prior to the official hearing process, where we move that person who committed that violation into another program or another arena that will serve the purpose that incarceration will, which is to basically convince this person that not to do crime anymore. At least that's the hope. Research has shown that, training new police officers may also be difficult. Training must prepare officers to not only deal with day-to-day crime fighting, but also make them less reliant on their crime fighting skills and more effective problem solvers. And we've been seeing a trend towards that now. For the last 10 years, law enforcement has really been focusing on communication as the major mechanism for de-escalation. Obviously, we don't want people to not have access to use of force option when they are in a situation that would require it. If you have the opportunity to talk somebody down, then it's incumbent upon you to use it. However, if you don't, you have to engage, and you have to make those decisions to be able to do that. And right now, with things getting more muddied, a lot of officers are having a lot of reluctance to make those decisions because they don't want to have to deal with the repercussions. And I get it. Just recently in the news, I saw what it was baffling to me, where two officers in Washington, D.C. were making an arrest, or rather not an arrest, they were trying to initiate a traffic stop of somebody who was riding a moped on a sidewalk. Obviously, that's a violation, a moving violation. It's not major, but it's a moving violation. They weren't speeding. It's a moped, for gosh sake. Well, this person who they were following, the officers lit up the vehicle, and instructions to pull over. This person continued on riding their moped, and came to an intersection, and as opposed to stopping or waiting for it to be safe, they blasted across the intersection. And unfortunately, cross traffic was there, and they got hit and they got killed. Well, the way under all other circumstances, law enforcement was acting well within the scope of their duty and their responsibility. They saw a person in violation of a vehicle code. They weren't using any excessive force. They weren't trying to ram them over or anything. They were, basically following them and saying, "Hey, look, they weren't on a high-speed chase." The guy made a fatal decision, ultimately a fatal decision, when he decided he was going to ride his vehicle, try to get away, and go across the road, where he got hit and killed. We found out today that these officers are being charged federally for one of them is being charged for murder, and the other one, I want to say it's something like a dereliction of duty, or working outside the color of authority. And based on, again, I don't know all the circumstances. I know exactly what I'm telling you now, but that should have fallen. That incident should have fallen under qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is something that's given to all officers, and a lot of people have this misconception about what it is. But in essence, it is immunity from prosecution of the officers acting within his color or her color of authority. In other words, what the law tells them they can do. So the officers were doing exactly what the law told them they were allowed to do, and are doing it in good faith, right? They like, say for instance, you were going to go and you were issuing an arrest warrant. Well, the person who actually wrote the warrant out falsified the warrant, so it was a bad warrant. So you were serving in a warrant. It was a bad warrant, and you conducted the arrest and everything else. Well, since you served a bad warrant, everything that happened on that warrant would be tainted. But because you didn't know, you have qualified immunity for that. In other words, you're not going to be held accountable because you weren't the one who generated the warrant and falsified the information in it to the court. You only assisted in the serving of the warrant, initiating what the judge basically said to do. So qualified immunity doesn't give absolute immunity. It's very, very focused, and it appears, and again, this is just an appearance because I don't know the entire circumstance of the entire incident, but based on what I know, this appears to be a significant violation of qualified immunity. And and it's disheartening because you have cops who are now getting afraid of, oh my gosh, all I did was pull a guy over and he made a bad decision. Now I'm going to get arrested for it. I'm arrested, and so that kind of puts a fear into law enforcement, and specifically training new officers. All right, so we're on slide number 7, I believe. Types of policing. So you're going to see this again. Problem-oriented policing. So you'll see that. And that's a style of policing or police operations that stress a proactive problem-solving approach rather than reactive crime fighting. So Remember, we talked about what proactive was, and we didn't really talk about what reactive. And so essentially, reactive means that when the crime actually occurs and it's announced, then law enforcement gets dispatched. Now, in the very rare occasions, does that result in arrest and or the stopping of the crime? In other words, preventing it. More often than not, proactive policing is what does that. The problem with it, again, like I said, when we start getting too proactive, we run the risk of encroaching on community civil liberties and basically making them afraid of policing. So there's a fine line. Many police departments utilize special forces or units with specialized trainings for different types of crime. These units are deployed in areas where these types of crimes are prevalent, right? So SWAT and NMT, which is negotiations management, and they have a number of different here in the Central Valley, in Madera specifically, you have MadNet, MadGat. So that's MadNet is the Madera Narcotics Enforcement Team, and then MadGet is the Madera Gang Enforcement Team. And so they'll utilize them, and then you have interagency workings, where you'll have multiple agencies working within that department or within that unit. Hotspots of crime are places which significant portions of police calls originate. Some hotspots include bars, housing projects, motels. We talked about some of the depressed areas and areas where people have a tendency to congregate. Intelligence-led policing is a collection and analysis of information to generate intelligent end product by providing information to police to help them make decisions on both tactical and strategic level. Intelligence-led policing relies heavily on confidential informants, offender interviews, and careful analysis of crime reports, calls for service, suspect surveillance, and community sources of information. Virtually all law enforcement engage in this, and they incorporate it into their policing regimen. Again, we talked a little bit about what CompStat was, right? And so this is one of the ideas of intelligence-led policing. Intelligence-led policing has components of community-oriented policing in that they both rely on residents of the community to gather their intelligence, and we talked a little bit about that. So going in as a detective, some of them do undercover, suspect surveillance, that kind of stuff. All right, this last slide on Chapter 5 is called Fusion Centers. Now, this is a specific department, and they have a very specific role. So in the spring of 2002, law enforcement executives met at a criminal intelligence sharing summit. And after this meeting, the National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan, NCISP, was developed. And NCISP is a formal intelligence gathering initiative that identifies security and intelligence needs in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So this is essentially a component of the Patriot Act. It was the idea that not only, because let's look at things from a very basic fact. Your primary response to virtually every single event, terrorist event, is going to be your local law enforcement. It's always going to be your local law enforcement. FBI will wind up getting dispatched at a later date. DHS, that's the Department of Homeland Security, they'll get dispatched. And if necessary, obviously the National Guard or reserves, depending on how severe or serious that situation is. So NCISP initiated the following, and you may see these again: a model intelligence sharing plan and a mechanism to promote it, a blueprint for administrators to follow for building an intelligence system, a model for intelligence process called principles and policies, a plan respects and protects individual privacy and civil rights, technology architecture to provide seamless sharing of information, a national model for intelligence training, outreach plan to promote timely and incredible intelligence sharing, and a plan to leverage existing systems, allowing for flexibility of new technology and process enhancement. So basically, what all that means is that, and this is one of the problems of law enforcement that really doesn't get told a lot. So remember we talked about how law enforcement works up a hierarchy, right? And sometimes law enforcement has problems with the sharing or the dissemination of information because they want to be the one, especially, and if you look at it from the, I mean, they're very selfish reasons. So I'll preface what I'm going to say with that. But law enforcement likes to, if they've done all the work on an investigation, right? You've done all the work on this investigation, they're really reluctant to release all of that data before the arrest actually happens because they want to be the one, that department who did all that work wants to be the one to get credit for the caller, for the arrest, for, for basically breaking the case. So there are a number of times where law enforcement's communication networks between agencies isn't very established. Fusion centers were designed to eliminate that idea, right? They were saying, look, we need to look way beyond who did what to whom. We need to start sharing this information amongst ourselves to hopefully prevent something like this from ever happening again, right? So now these fusion centers work as essentially a melting point, a communication hub where the sheriff's department, police departments, Department of Justice, all these areas are submitting their data to, so that way Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, those are the two primary organizations who are responsible for domestic investigations with regard to terrorist activity. Those two departments have a huge trough of data, and it's not just held by one agency that might have been reluctant because they were conducting an investigation themselves, right? So that, and obviously it's the sharing of technologies, it's the sharing of information. It talks about introduction of new technologies and processes with regard to these exchanges, and then how they do all these things while still maintaining, this confidentiality and civil liberties for the community that they're serving. So there's a number of things that fusion centers are involved with, but their primary responsibility was specifically to identify security and intelligence needs, security needs and intelligence needs in the wake or as a result of 9/11. Okay, so that covers chapter 5. And let's move this over. We're going to open up chapter 6 right now. And let's see here. Here we go. We should be able to blaze through 6. 6 has 7 slides, so hopefully we can get this knocked out in the next, say, 30 minutes, 45 minutes at the most, I would say. All right. So we talked about law enforcement, specifically police, what their responsibilities are. But now we're going to talk about police and the specifics of who they are. So not what their responsibilities are, but who are they? How are they composed? And, some of the problems, some of the areas that law enforcement has to deal with and their day-to-day responsibilities. Okay. So who are the police? The dynamics and ethnic composition of today's police departments are really diverse. And that's changed. Less than 50 years ago, most departments in large metropolitan areas, were composed primarily of Caucasian males with an education no higher than high school diplomas. And today, 13% of all peace officers are female. 27% of all peace officers come from a minority ethnic group. Heterogeneous police force can be instrumental in gaining confidence of the people within the community served. And so that's pretty self-explanatory. People we're all Americans, right? But unfortunately, most people are very tribal by nature, so they try to find commonalities. Well, most commonalities are based off of appearance, and appearance is could be a binding agent, rather, if you will, for community. So Hispanic, African American, Asian, they have a tendency to congregate together because they feel more comfortable. Language, customs, that kind of stuff. They're all the foods that they eat, right? So all those things, people will naturally congregate with people that make them feel better. And so when you have all a Caucasian police force, or a primarily Caucasian police force, there may be issues with regard to community trust. But when you have law enforcement officers from all ethnicities, all religious backgrounds, various, both male and female, and you have that diversity in your force, it kind of makes more people feel, okay, they're not just after me. I could be a police officer too if I wanted to. It's not just one certain group or one certain gender. So the earliest known date of an African American hired as a peace officer was in 1861 in Washington, D.C. Chicago hired its first African American officer in 1872, and according to a book written by Nicholas Alex titled Black in Blue, African American officers of the time suffered from what he called a double marginality. All right, so you may see this again. Double marginality is a social burden African American officers carry by virtue of being both a minority group and a law enforcement officer. And you don't really, at least I haven't seen it in my nearly 30 years in law enforcement. I've heard stories, but again, I got to tell you, I've been working in the field of law enforcement since 1988, and even during that time, we had a very diverse pool of people working as peace officers. So we really didn't have issues where a person suffered from being marginalized as a result of their ethnicity, because we are all wearing the same uniform. And I know this. This was something I was brought up with. My father was in the Air Force, and so I lived on an air base for most of my life as a young child. My first exposure to school was in junior high school, to a public school in junior high school. Before that, I was in DOD school. DOD is Department of Defense school. And we obviously there's many different ethnicities in the military. And so there was never any that I can recall, and again I was young, but none that I could recall of any racial tension on any military base, and I've been to plenty. I've been all over the world, and I can tell you that for the most part, it pretty much fares the same in law enforcement and in these departments. In 1910, Los Angeles hired its first female police officer and gave her the power of arrest. Her name was Alice Stebbins Wells. While there have been major strides regarding the acceptance of women in policing, there have been some social barriers that have made becoming a female peace officer problematic. So, on the CT question, again, we're not answering CT questions. There's two trains of thought, right, with regard to female peace officers. So we know law enforcement can be a physically demanding job, and as a result, there are some females who can't match the strength and stamina of the male, and that's just based off of biology, right? It's nothing. I'm trying not to phrase it in a way that would be detrimental, right? Women absolutely have an asset, which I was going to get to, and that's their ability to communicate. Women have a tendency to be able to de-escalate tense situations if the people that they're dealing with are at least receptive to it. I mean, there's going to be some times when it doesn't matter how accommodating you're going to be as a peace officer, that they don't care and they're just going to do what they want to do because that's what they want to do. And that does happen, unfortunately, but we found that women have an ability to mitigate, arbitrate some of these confrontations, and they come across better. They're less apt to rely on use of force options, and have, by and large, better results when it comes to dealing with conflict resolution. So there's flips on both sides of that, and the old belief that women had no business in policing has pretty much been set aside now. Women have been in law enforcement for quite some time. We're talking 100 years now, over 100 years, and they've demonstrated that they can ascend through the ranks and run an entire precinct, run an entire department, and have just as much to contribute to policing as any male does. So, like I said, a lot of these, what's being written here or presented, is kind of looking back at what law enforcement might have been even before I got involved in it. So, police profession. Many law enforcement agencies still don't require a college education. A number of agencies are requiring some type of advanced education beyond high school. So, and there has been a move to that based off of professionalism. And so, I mean, how many of you guys have seen law enforcement petitioning the government for more money, right? And so if they're going to request more money, there has to be some kind of justification for it. So most government organizations saying, well, fine, we'll give you more money, but you have to undergo more training. You have to, and we're going to move the standards up a little bit. And the communities have been wanting that as well. Like most other jobs, the nature of police work causes most officers to band together, creating a subculture, right? Officers get done with work, they want to go out and have a few beers. This subculture is characterized by cynicism, which is the belief that other people's actions are motivated by personal needs and selfishness. As a result, police officers insulate themselves by isolating themselves from the rest of society in what's known as a blue curtain. This isolation can metastasize to a code of silence if left unchecked. So what they're getting at is pretty much what happens in virtually every single industry in the world, right? People who work together have a tendency to congregate together. The difference here is that this job, remember I said early on in the beginning part of this, nobody calls cops because they're having a good day. Everyone calls a cop because they have a problem they cannot solve. And so for the most part, law enforcement deals with problems all day long. They see some pretty bad problems and the results of those bad problems all day, every day, all the time, for years and years and years on end. So they see basically the worst of society, and especially if you're working in a prison. So if you're working in prisons and jails, that's all you see. I mean, at least law enforcement every once in a while might help an old lady across the street or help somebody fix their tire, so they get to see some goodness. You're working in a prison, you ain't seeing that. That doesn't happen. So, of course, given that, you're going to have cynicism. You're going to have the idea that most people are bad, right? Most people are bad. And when they all get together and all believe that most people are bad, that's the idea, or the bad idea, of the blue curtain. And then it could metastasize, change to it's between us and them. And I got to protect us all the time, despite us sometimes also breaking the law. So you have to be really, really careful, all right? Some experts today describe police officer core beliefs to include police officers that are the only real crime fighters. No one else understands the nature of police work, loyalty to colleagues above all else. It's impossible to win the war on crime without bending rules, and the public is unsupportive and patrol work is unpleasant. So this is what some officers are telling researchers. They're saying that, and I mean, let's look at it. I mean, it's a really sad state of affairs when people start really believing this in their heart of hearts. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I there have been times where I make these jump assessments. When I was working as a peace officer, and based off of my previous experiences, you have 100 contacts. 101 is likely going to be the same as the other 99. So, and then with the changes in departmental policy, some of the catch and release, I'm sure you guys have heard that term used especially a lot now. So law enforcement are, they're going out, they're catching the bad guys, they're using use of force. They're all scratched up, cut up and everything. And then they book them into jail, and they're like, wow, I got this guy off the street. They feel pretty good. Next day, they're on patrol, and they see that same guy walking down the street going, hey, yeah, they let me out. And you're like, great, thanks. So, that can be disheartening. There are 4 basic styles of policing, so you're going to see this again. And these are not necessarily styles of policing. I know that's what it says in there, but these are police officer styles, or the ideas behind officer, and they've named them these 4 different categories. So you have the crime fighter, who believes the most important aspect of the job is investigating serious crimes and arresting criminals. So that's what they believe. Community, contacting with the community, working for proactive policing and trying to mitigate future crime. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to make you feel good. I'm not going to tuck you in. You want me to make you safe. I'm going to find the bad guys. I'm going to arrest them. I'm going to put them in jail. Crime fighter. The social agent. That's a person who believes that they are community problem solvers. So they're the ones who are, walking the old lady across the street. They're the ones who are out shooting hoops with the kids, trying to, get them to make good decisions. They are the school resource officers. They are the probation officers. So these are the guys and ladies who are trying to, show that they have an understanding of the community and want to help the community as a whole. The law enforcer is this is the duty that's clearly codified in law, and they make their decisions by the book. So they're a lot like the crime fighter, but the crime fighter is looking only for serious crimes. They're not worried about, minor infractions. The crime fighter is not going to involve themselves. They see a kid running across the street. That's a non-starter. I'm not worried about that. I'm out there looking for the burglary guy or the robbery guy, and I'm out trying to find out who's making the next dope deal. Those are crimes. I want to find those. But the law enforcer will go by the book. So when they see that kid running across the street, they're going to make the contact, and they're going to go, well, I need to take you over here. We need to do this. We need to do that. So that's the law enforcement. And the last one is the watchman. And that watchman style is characterized by maintaining public order. So the watchman only takes action when and if a problem arises. Watchmen are a lot like all these other ones rolled into one, but they're the ones who will only do it if they believe it is absolutely necessary. More often than not, watchmen are going to be the veterans, right? These are the guys who have been around for 20 years, and they're like, look, I'm not going to go arrest this guy because it's not going to make any damn difference. We know what's going to wind up happening. I'm going to wait for him to go and do A, B, and C so I can make contact over here, and then I'm going to arrest a whole group of those people so that way I can not have to worry about just that one guy again, right? So that's the watchman. All right, moving on to slide number 3. Police discretion. A lot of you probably don't think that law enforcement has discretion, but in fact they do, and thank the Lord that they do, because you'd have a lot more crimes and a lot more arrests if we didn't. So one of the responsibilities of the peace officers is to have the power of personal discretion. So what is personal discretion? That's the use of personal decision-making and choice, personal decision-making skills and choice in carrying out the operations of the criminal justice system. So personal discretion is also referred to as low visibility decision-making. The concept of emotional intelligence is defined by the ability to monitor one's own feelings and emotions in order to guide action. This ability allows a peace officer to recognize their emotional state and ensure it's not the primary reason for a discretionary decision making. So it can go on both sides, right? So, and we'll use the example I used a couple seconds ago with the kid running across the street. So, what do you believe would be the overall reason for making contact with a kid? Let's say you see a kid, they're at the park, they're having a good time, they kick the ball, and they go booking across the street, right? And you see them. They're not looking, they just run across the street. Is that a violation of law? Absolutely. Are you within your right to go ahead and take that child into custody? Absolutely. Can you make a personal discretion and try to help solve the ultimate problem, which is to have the kid not run across the street? Yes. And that's probably the best course of action. You walk them over, you intervene, say, look, you could go, this is what can happen to you, you didn't look, so on and so forth. There's rules for a reason, except whatever speech you're going to give. On the flip side, when we're talking about the emotional intelligence, so that's you being able to look within yourself and go, am I using my discretion appropriately, or am I using my discretion based off of my own emotion? In other words, say for instance we had, and I've used this example, we have two thefts, right? So thefts. One is a guy who runs in and gets a 6-pack of beer and a candy bar, and the other one runs in and gets a canister of formula. So, you're a new father or a new mother, and the person that you make contact with starts telling you the reasoning behind why they stole the formula. And you decide, as opposed to conducting the arrest or writing the citation, that you're going to let them off and say, look, I understand, here's a, blah, blah, blah. You have some authority to make these discretionary calls, but on the flip side, you have to also recognize that while you may empathize or sympathize with the individual's reasoning, they may not be in their best interest, right? They may not be. So you have to be able to monitor that and know there are going to be times where you don't think a person should be arrested. I mean, how many of us have cheered, and I'll be the first to admit, have cheered when a father has found a perpetrator, doing something to his or her children, right? Like in court, beating the heck out of him. You're like, yes, he deserved it. Yeah, but your belief that he deserved it does not allow, the law doesn't allow for that. It doesn't allow for giving that kind of a discretion. So you have to be able to understand that there are going to be some instances where your own personal moral code needs to be put aside to be able to follow the law, right? All right. Police have less discretion as the severity of the crime increases. I use that example. So if you saw or can admonish a speeding driver and let them off with a warning, that's one thing, right? But if you see that same speeding driver and they happen to be under the influence of alcohol, you probably wouldn't want to let them go. And if you did, there could be consequences, right? You let them go, they get into an accident after the fact, all that comes out, and we have a problem. So there are other factors also, such as environmental factors, departmental factors. So an environmental factor would be, what the situation is out. So continuing with the same scenario, if a guy is speeding and there's nobody else out and the road's empty and it's wide and you just happen to be out there, you were enjoying your lunch, you want to find a quiet place to sit and eat your bologna sandwich, and all of a sudden this guy goes flying down the road. He doesn't see you because you had your lights off, you're on the side of the road. Yeah, you can light him up, and if you wanted to, you could use your discretion to say, look, you know what, the road was empty, I get it, but don't do it again, right? However, if it's pouring cats and dogs, and and the road is real narrow, real bumpy, and you see a flying down the road, well, you're gonna go, wait a minute, guy, come on now, and it's raining. Let's have a little common sense. The likelihood is that you're gonna wind up having to ticket that individual. So again, environmental factors, departmental factors. The departmental factor would be like, hey, you know what? We've had a number of complaints of people speeding, so we need to start making more contacts with individuals who are violating this part of the law, and we need to start issuing citations to hopefully curb this behavior. Peer factors, so that would be like another officer engaging in the discretion at one point and then not in another will convince you, hey, you know what, I let that guy go before, but it's probably not a good idea to do it again. And then obviously situational factors, that's self-explanatory. And the offender's demeanor. So, somebody, you make contact with them, you're like, hey, oh, you know what, I'm so sorry. I wasn't even paying attention. I mean, somebody who's humble about it. Versus guys like, hey, aren't you like late for your donut or whatever? That guy is probably going to wind up reading a number of different moving violations on a little yellow slip of paper that he's going to be issued in roughly 15 minutes. So all those things have an impact on whether discretion or how much discretion is going to be given. A significant issue in the use of discretion is extra legal factors. So what is extra legal? And I know it sounds like that's a good thing. Extra legal actually is not a good thing. So extra legal is the idea of looking at something and putting a non-legal bias on it. And so in this instance, they utilize race. So while the evidence that minorities are searched more than whites, there is little evidence to suggest that it's racial profiling. Racial profiling is the practice of police targeting minority groups because of belief they are more likely engaged in criminal activity. So what those extra legal factors are inferring is that you're looking at non-legal components to make a determination on whether or not you're going to give discretion. An example, and we won't use race as an example, we'll use money. So if I am a law enforcement officer and I'm sitting at the road and I'm doing this number here, and I see a Mercedes-Benz SL500, beautiful car going flying by. I was like, man, that's a beautiful car. He's 15 miles an hour the speed limit, but those cars are real safe, and so that's kind of cool. And then you see a 1987 Hyundai Elantra with zip ties holding the bumper and everything, and the wheels splayed out like so, and he or she is doing the exact same speed. You're like, oh hell yeah, I'd light this dude up. It wasn't the speeding that is making that change. It's an extra legal factor, something that doesn't have anything to do with any type of discretion, right? And so you want to look. I went overly simple. Most of the time, extra legal factors have to do with racial profiling, but I wanted to make it more like kind of crazy. So that's what they're talking about. You don't want to let inappropriate biases influence your decision when it comes to discretion. All right, so let's move on. Problems of policing. So four most significant problems of policing include job stress, fatigue, violence, and corruption. You'll see those again. Stress, fatigue, violence, corruption. The threat of having to use violence or having violence used against you is a major source of job stress. So obviously getting involved in a use of force incident is a major source of stress, especially nowadays. I mean, when this was written, when this book was written, Facebook, I don't want to say it was in its infancy, but wasn't as tech savvy, and there wasn't as much tech that was out. Now, anybody who's got a cell phone and a Facebook app or a YouTube app, which is virtually everybody because those phones come equipped with them, is their own walking TV studio, right? they can literally, with a couple of clicks of the button, be able to broadcast live everything that's going on. Not record it, but broadcast it as it's happening. And so you're engaged in trying to effect an arrest. You're having to utilize force to effect that arrest. And you've got, and it's a one-on-one situation, and there's 5 people around you, and none of them are helping you, but every one of them has their phones out. It is a common occurrence. And you're looking around like, oh my God, this person wants to do harm to me. They're not trying to escape. They're fighting me and trying to go for my weapon. And so, huge job stress. On top of the fact that when you start involving yourselves, or when you become involved in that type of a situation, the level of force starts to increase. And as a result of that level of force increasing, your liability, at least in the eye of the public, also increases if the public decides that they didn't like the way you effected that arrest. So lots of stress. Fatigue. A lot of law enforcement are having to deal with being on a job for 24 hours a day, right? I mean, overtime's great. People go like, oh, you got overtime. But when you get ordered continuously, and it happened to me, and if you're going into law enforcement, I can promise you it's going to happen to you at least once in your career, if not more. And you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I cannot do this anymore. And what's even worse is after you do that, after you're exhausted, you finally get paid, you get vilified by newspapers, by other people saying that, you guys are earning too much money and you're getting too much overtime. You're like, well, I didn't ask for the overtime. I was ordered to do it, and they have to pay me. So not only are you exhausted from stress from working it, but you're also being vilified in the back end for having to work it and getting compensated for doing that. Plus, like it said, law enforcement has a tendency to bind together. So emotional detachment especially from significant others, they carry their work home. You're sitting there and your wife or your husband goes, what's wrong? And you're like, you wouldn't understand. You wouldn't understand. Don't worry about it. And so when that starts to happen, those divides start to happen. And then, like I said, the criminal catch and release system, those kind of things you're just like, I can't believe why am I going out and arresting these people? So there's been a number of efforts to combat these types of stresses with regard to departmental training. And then virtually every department now has what's an EAP, which is an employee assistance program to help them cope with stresses and counseling services and that kind of stuff that are available to them. Many people have been at work at one time or another, or been a piece of, many people have been tired at work at one time or another. That's what I was getting at, sorry. And however, being a peace officer, it can lead to disaster. Officers are often ordered over, and we talked about that a second ago, 16 hours plus, return home for a quick nap, then go back out for another 16. And then all the studies have shown that there are officers who have worked more than 80 hours in a week. Controlling this fatigue requires a larger police force or creative scheduling to ensure officers are not subjected to too much overtime. And it, like I said, it can become debilitating to a point where they can't do their jobs. And I can speak to this specifically in the prison. So you have officers who are assigned to towers. And so if you have an officer assigned to a tower and an inmate escapes, goes over the wall or digs under or does whatever, and that officer falls asleep in the tower, you pretty much lost your job, right? You're not going to have a job. That is an offense that you can be terminated for, and it does happen. Evidence suggests only a small portion of police officers are continually involved in use of force incidents, and that's what they're saying is there are certain officers that involve themselves in use of force more than other ones, and those ones do it on a regular basis. Many of these are young, inexperienced officers, so in an attempt to curb their violence, many departments mandate annual training in the form of use of force policies to minimize police brutality. Police brutality includes unnecessary and unreasonable force, coercion, threats, harassment. One of the major controlling factors in police brutality are the threats of civil judgments against peace officers who work outside the color of authority. So there's a lot of stuff there. Let me break it down. So first, unnecessary, unreasonable. Two different components. Unnecessary would be, say for instance, you were arresting somebody, you have them in a prone position. That means they're on their belly on the ground. They're cooperating, right? They're cooperating. And you decide that you're going to put your knee in the small of their back to cause them pain, or you give them a, what's the faceplate twist, which cuts into the wrist. So that was not necessary at all. It is a use of force that was unnecessary. An unreasonable use of force would be a point in time where use of force was required. In other words, you were required to put this person in a bar hammer lock to get them to stop wiggling around. However, once they did and you had the cuffs on them, you decided, oh, time to slam them into the wall. That's an unreasonable use of force. So unnecessary, you had control of the situation, you used it. Unreasonable is used too much, even though a use of force was called for, you used too much of it. Corruption is the exercising of legitimate discretion for illegitimate discretion for improper reasons, or using illegal means to achieve approved goals. So what they're talking about here is officers who use their discretion for improper reasons. In other words, kickbacks, right? So traffic cop pulls the guy over, and it's the mayor, and the mayor goes, hey, tell you what, dude, I can't get another ticket. I know it's your job, but I'll tell you what, if you turn your head, I'll make sure that I talk to the chief and we see if we can't get you out of traffic and get you over to where you want to be. You're like, oh, heck yeah, that sounds good. I didn't see nothing, boss. You have a great day. Boom. That would be using discretion, but for an improper reason. Using illegal means to achieve approved goals would be fruit of the poisonous tree, right? So conducting a search by providing false evidence for the warrant, or conducting the search without a warrant, or questioning an individual after they said that they're not going to waive their rights. They're like, I'm not going to say anything to you. I want my attorney. Continuing to do that, that's using illegal means to achieve approved goals. So the Knapp Commission, an investigative body of New York precincts, classified corruption among peace officers into two categories. You will see this again. Meat eaters are police officers who actively solicit bribes and vigorously engage in corrupt practices. So that would be the more along the lines of illegal means to achieve approved goals, or illegal means to achieve personal enrichment, right? So these are guys who really don't care. They're using their authority to do the wrong thing. We see movies about this all the time. Training Day, for instance, great movie. If you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage it. But it's about a corrupt cop who involves himself in drugs and with the gangs and stuff, and gets kickbacks for all these, and then a good cop that didn't know that was going on and doesn't want to involve themselves in that. So those would be considered meat eaters. Grass eaters are police officers who accept payoffs for everyday police duties and responsibilities. These are the cops who are they're not nearly as, I don't want to say corrupt, because they're still doing something that's against the law, but they accept bribes and gratuities for atypical stuff. Example, you you go to a grocery store and the grocery store owner knows that you're a cop and goes, dude, take whatever you want. It's cool. Just, I've been robbed the last couple of times. So if you wouldn't mind just, patrolling around here a little bit more, um, you know, uh, just having your presence around the area might deter some of these guys. I've been getting broken into at about 2 in the morning and 3 in the morning and that kind of stuff. And so the cop's like, oh, cool, yeah, I'll do that. So he takes his milk, he takes his eggs, he takes this, and bags it up, and he walks out, and he gets this free stuff, and now he's on the job, and as opposed to using his authority in his area where he's supposed to be patrolling, he focuses patrol there. So he was getting a payoff essentially for doing what he's supposed to do. Those are grass eaters. Okay, number 5. Use of force. All right, so you're going to see this again. So use of force. Use of force is the amount of force that an objective, trained, and competent peace officer faced with similar facts and circumstances would consider necessary and reasonable to subdue an attacker, overcome resistance, effect custody, or gain compliance with a lawful order. That is use of force. Okay, and what it's based, the idea that it's based off of, is looking at what another peace officer, another person who has the same training that you have, would have done in the exact same situation. And if that person who is doing that review says that in that same situation I would have done the same thing, then that was a lawful arrest, or that was a lawful use of force. All right. Deadly force is a force that is likely to cause death or great bodily harm. While TV and movies depict police officers in a constant flow of deadly force encounters, the truth is that each year police engage in approximately 400 deadly force encounters where the suspect is killed, and that's across the nation. All right, that's not just one department, that's across the nation. Some of these incidents are intentionally perpetrated by the offender as a form of suicide, so if you were to remove those, it would be even less. It's becoming so common that the term suicide by cop has been adopted to denote a victim precipitated into killings by police. So we can see that deadly force, while it is used, isn't used nearly as much as movies, and unfortunately in this day and age, our news is portraying that it just doesn't happen. Non-deadly force is force that is unlikely to cause serious bodily injury. All right, so I want you to understand non-deadly force. I don't know that I would utilize this term. This is the term the book uses. Many departments have moved away from the idea of deadly force and non-deadly force to what they call lethal force and less lethal force. They don't like using the term non anymore. And the reason why you say non, or they're not using non-deadly or non-lethal, is because in reality, any use of force could result in a lethal outcome. In other words, the person that the force is being used on can wind up dying from it. I mean, we've seen incidents where individuals have been pepper sprayed. The intent wasn't to kill them, it was to incapacitate them so they can be placed into custody. But ultimately, that incident, they died, right? So departments have moved away, because you have to remember that while a department understands this, ultimately a layperson, the citizen, has to be able to understand it. And if you tell a regular Joe citizen that this is non-lethal, they're going to go, well, if it's non-lethal, why'd they die? And that's a legitimate question, right? Why'd they die if it's non-lethal? So many departments are moving away from that terminology, much like they're moving away with, I'm sure you've heard this term before, accidental discharge, right? I had an accidental discharge. Well, no. An accident is something that occurs as a result of no action on the part, or an action that couldn't be avoided. It basically infers that there is no fault. But we learned that through investigation that many of these accidental discharges by peace officers are the result of the mishandling of the weapon, or the playing around, or doing something they probably shouldn't be doing. So the department moved away from accidental discharge and moved to negligent discharge. And that's a more apt description rather, because if you pull your firearm out of your holster and you're sitting at the desk and you start spinning it on your finger and it discharges and shoots you in the leg, was that an accident? Or was that you playing around and spinning your firearm on your finger and shooting yourself in the leg? That was negligent, right? So that's a more apt description. And in this case, moving back to deadly force and non-deadly force, many departments now are using the term deadly force and then less deadly, or lethal force and less lethal. And the reason why they do that, like I said, is so that way if a less lethal use of force option is used, the likelihood of it resulting in a death is minimal, but not absolute. So most use of force options include firearms that have a deadly force implications. Otherwise, it pretty much firearms have deadly force implications. In other words, when a law enforcement officer uses a firearm, the intent is to stop the threat, but the likelihood is high that a death is going to result as a result of the use of that firearm, especially given the training. Where do law enforcement's or where are they trained to shoot? They're trained to shoot center mass, essentially in the torso. And so anywhere in the torso, 1 or 2 rounds, there is a high likelihood that the person isn't going to survive that encounter. On non-deadly or less lethal use of forces, those use of force would be pretty much every other use of force option. So you got what used to be the PR-24, the baton, now it's the expandable baton, knock asp, pepper sprays, contact taser, remote tasers, and then any number of different, officers are using. Now they have the bing bags for the shotguns. Those are less lethal force options. And so if it's not a firearm that doesn't shoot projectiles, lead projectiles or copper projectiles, then it's a less lethal or non-deadly use of force option. And we talked about CDCR and DAPO. DAPO is parole. They've stopped using non-deadly force terminology, replacing it with less lethal. And so less lethal weapons are designed to immobilize or disable the suspect, to take him into custody, as opposed to permanently stop the suspect by killing them. All right, number 6. So police searches and interrogations. And the need for peace officers to gather evidence, interrogations and searches must be accomplished. The Fourth Amendment restricts police searches to reasonable standard. Likewise, when police wish to interrogate a suspect, under the Fifth Amendment prohibition against forcing people to incriminate themselves. So essentially, law enforcement can't just go in and conduct a search of their own volition. They have to have reasonable suspicion, and then if they're going to conduct a search of a personal property, that standard moves up to probable cause, and then that has to be authorized by a court. In 1966, the case of Miranda v. Arizona was heard by the Supreme Court, and in the decision, the court maintained that before police can question a person who's been arrested or in custody, they must inform the arrestee of their Fifth Amendment right to be free from self-incrimination. In other words, they don't have to admit to the wrongdoing of the crime. They only have to talk about it, right? The Miranda warning was developed, which includes advising the arrestee of the right to remain silent. And if they make a statement, it will be used against them in the court, and their right to counsel, and have the counsel present during the interrogation. And if they can't afford the attorney, one will be appointed by the state. Further, as of late, following these advisements, law enforcement must get a confirmation that they understand their rights, and if they're going to ask these questions, they have to secure a waiver of those rights before they start questioning. So, do you understand these rights as I've read them to you? Yes. Bearing these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to me now? No. Okay. That used to be all that was required. Now, many departments are having the suspect write that out, yes or no, and they're having them, put it all in writing, or with body cameras they have a video record of the admonishment and the confirmation of understanding, and then the securing of the waiver. Search warrant. A court order issued by a judge authorizing and directing law enforcement to search a designated place for evidence of a crime and or to secure the arrest of a person and bring them before the court. In order for a court to issue a warrant, law enforcement must provide sufficient evidence to justify its issuance. And remember, you're going to see this again. The level of evidence is called probable cause. Probable cause is the evidentiary standard which is necessary to sustain arrest or a search warrant. The evidentiary standard is less than beyond a reasonable doubt, but greater than reasonable suspicion. And so people ask me, I've had students ask, and I tell you guys this up front with regard to percentages. People are like, well, I mean, what is it in percentages? So probable cause is 51%. If you were to, is it likely that that happened? If the answer is yes, then the warrant will be issued. If the answer is no, then the warrant isn't issued. Okay, so probable cause, 51%. Beyond a reasonable doubt, about 90%. In other words, yeah, I'm sure beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, all reasonable doubts, all excuses are put aside because I've got so much evidence that this happened. Does that mean it's absolute? No, it doesn't mean it's absolute. Some people have asked, well, why not absolute? Well, the reason why is because in no way, shape, or form can anybody be absolutely 100% certain that a crime has or hasn't been committed. That standard of evidence would be, it's considered absolute certainty. That standard of evidence, 100%, would require a significant amount of evidence, and in all likelihood result in a number of individuals not being held to account for their criminal behavior. All right. So moving on to the last slide, warrantless searches and the exclusionary rule. So we're going to go through these pretty quickly. Supreme Court's ruled under certain circumstances a valid search may be conducted without a warrant. A search incident to a valid arrest where the officer is permitted to search the subject's person and immediate surrounding area under his or her control. However, the Supreme Court recently ruled that digital information on a cell phone cannot be searched without consent. So, in other words, I search you, I don't find anything on you, I have a cell phone, I believe that you're involved in buy-sell transactions of controlled substances, I have to secure a warrant to conduct a search of your phone. I can't. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I can't get permission to do it. So I can ask the person that I have in custody, say, I'm going to take a look at what you say that you're not doing anything. Let me look at your phone. Go ahead and unlock it for me. Can I look at your phone? Is that cool? Cool, great, thank you. And so if I get permission, then that's fine. But again, that's kind of a shaky area. If you know that you're relatively confident, it's always better to get the arrest warrant. All right, officers can stop and frisk when they have reasonable suspicion that a crime has taken place, is taking place, or is about to, and we talked about that. An automobile may be searched without a warrant if there's probable cause to believe the car was involved in a crime. The area to be searched is generally limited to the areas within the vehicle that can be reached. So, on some of the older cars, everything within the cab, if the individuals are in there and that's where the contact was made, would be able to be reached easily, right? And so some of the older vehicles, they didn't have the pass-throughs that they have in these new vehicles now. So if, say for instance, you have people in the back seat, then you could in fact search the trunk because access was available on those pass-throughs. They could pull down the center part of the seat, check it back there, close it, like, oh, you can't search my trunk. Well, yeah, we kind of can because you did have access to that. So, search can be conducted by an officer with consent. So the consent must be given voluntarily and without threat or coercion. We talked about that up there. Um, Officers can secure evidence or contraband that's in plain view, and this is called a plain view search. So if you got called out for domestic violence, the person answers the door, you're like, oh, can I come in? We got a call out for domestic violence. Oh, yeah, my husband's arguing with me. He wants to beat me up. And you walk in, and there's, rolling papers sitting on the dining room table with a bunch of marijuana and some gram scales. We were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had that there. Oh yeah, it's a little bit too late. Sorry. Supreme Court identified exigent circumstance. So what is an exigent circumstance? It's something that's not in the ordinary, right? It is a circumstance that doesn't happen on a regular basis. And that's another reason for a warrantless search. This can be an emergency, threats to evidence, hot pursuit, or threats to others. In each instance, however, the officers must have probable cause to conduct the search. So, an example would be you are knocking on the door and you see furtive movement because they didn't have the windows closed or they had the windows open, and you see what appears to be cocaine and people getting it, putting it in trash bags and running into a bathroom to go flush it. Given what you saw, that's an exigent circumstance. You can affect the search at that point in time. Warrantless search can also be initiated by any peace officer on an individual on active probation or parole. And that's been under attack a lot lately in other states. Not as much in California, but they are now moving that standard of evidence over. So yes, you can conduct a search of their person and the area that they reside in. However, many courts are now starting to go, well, did you have any type of at least reasonable suspicion that a crime was taking place? And so, unfortunately, there's been a artificial increasing of the standard of evidence with regard to the warrantless searches of people on probation or parole. And that happens. That's going to be different pretty much in every county and in every state based off of the court's interpretation of that law. All right. The exclusionary rule is also known as the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. It notes that in violation of the Fourth Amendment, anything that's gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment cannot be used as evidence in court. And there are limited exceptions to the exclusionary rule, which are known as good faith exceptions. You'll see that again. A good faith exception is based on the principle that evidence secured may be used in a criminal trial even though the search warrant was faulty if the police acted in good faith when they sought to obtain the warrant from a judge. So remember what I talked about earlier when I used that example that an officer giving false information to the court granting that warrant. The warrant is served by another officer in concert with the officer who generated the warrant request, and now they find evidence. Can the evidence be used? Yes, because one, the officer that was involved in it or involved in writing the report wasn't the one who located the contraband, and number two, the person who located the contraband had to have no idea that warrant was faulty, initially faulty. Now, just understand, if that does happen and the court finds that you have falsified information, just because they've used that evidence doesn't necessarily mean that the officer who generated that warrant request, giving that knowing false information to the court, isn't going to suffer some type of consequence. So that's a perjury charge at best. They're probably looking at suspension from the department and could possibly look at prosecution. So that would not be good. So anyway, that concludes this the chapters 5 and 6. This was a little bit longer than I thought. So my apologies, but there was a lot of information, and it had to do specifically with policing. And as always, if you have any questions, issues, comments, or concerns with regard to the information presented, please get a hold of me. Once again, I apologize for my throat. I've had to take a number of drinks and coughs and everything, but I've been doing a lot of talking today. I'm hoping I recover a little bit for tomorrow's lecture, which will cover 7 and 8. and if I'm feeling up to it, I might move forward to 9 and 10. But anyway, you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps you in your studies and ultimately in your tests. Have a good day. Bye.